Welcome to Calm and Crime. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. Story 1, Lauren Giddings. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't hiding in dark alleys or lurking in shadowy forests. Sometimes they're living right next door, sharing the same hallways, attending the same classes, existing in plain sight while harboring unimaginable darkness. This is the story of Lauren Giddings, a brilliant young woman whose life was stolen just as she stood on the threshold of her dreams, and the neighbor whose carefully constructed facade would eventually crumble to reveal something truly horrifying. Lauren Giddings was 27 years old in the summer of 2011, and her entire life seemed to be unfolding exactly as she'd always imagined. She had just graduated from Mercer University School of Law in Macon, Georgia, joining a proud tradition of lawyers in a historic southern city, where old oak trees draped with Spanish moss lined streets that had witnessed centuries of American history. Lauren wasn't originally from Georgia. She'd grown up in Maryland, where she built a foundation of ambition, intelligence, and genuine warmth that would define her throughout her life. Those who knew her described someone who lit up every room she entered, someone whose laughter was infectious, and whose kindness seemed limitless. She was the kind of person who remembered small details about your life, who checked in on friends during difficult times, who made everyone around her feel seen and valued. After completing her undergraduate degree at Agnes Scott College, Lauren had set her sights on law school. It wasn't just about prestige or money for her. Lauren genuinely wanted to make a difference, to use the law as a tool for justice and positive change. When she was accepted to Mercer University's law school, she threw herself into her studies with characteristic determination. Law school is notoriously grueling. The reading load is crushing, the competition fierce, the pressure relentless, but Lauren thrived. She found her tribe among fellow students who shared late-night study sessions fueled by coffee and determination. She built friendships that sustained her through the difficult moments, and she excelled academically, proving that she had what it took to succeed in one of the most demanding professional paths anyone can choose. During her time at Mercer, Lauren lived in an apartment complex called Barrister's Hall, located on Georgia Avenue. The building was popular with law students because of its proximity to campus. It wasn't fancy, just a typical apartment complex with exterior walkways, multiple units sharing common walls and spaces. The kind of place where you'd nod to neighbors in passing and occasionally hear music or conversations through the walls. Lauren's apartment became her sanctuary. She decorated it with personal touches that reflected her personality, photos of family and friends, mementos from her travels and experiences, the accumulation of a life being actively lived. It was here that she studied for exams, here that she decompressed after long days, here that she felt safe and at home in a city that had initially been unfamiliar but had become her own. By June 2011, Lauren had accomplished what she'd set out to do. She'd completed law school, walked across the stage in her graduation gown, and received her diploma. All that stood between her and her official entry into the legal profession was the bar exam scheduled for later that summer. She'd already begun preparing, setting up a study schedule, gathering materials, mentally preparing for one final push before she could truly say she'd achieved her dream. But first, there was a celebration to attend. Her sister Kaitlyn was getting married in Maryland, and Lauren wouldn't have missed it for the world. The wedding was everything you'd hope for. Joyful, emotional, filled with love and laughter and hope for the future. Lauren was radiant throughout the festivities, celebrating her sister's happiness while also sharing her own excitement about what lay ahead. She told her family about her plans. After the bar exam, she was planning to move. The apartment in Macon had served its purpose, but Lauren was ready for the next chapter. She talked about her career aspirations, about the kind of law she wanted to practice, about the difference she hoped to make. Her parents and sister listened with pride, seeing in Lauren someone who had worked so hard and was finally about to reap the rewards of that dedication. On June 25, 2011, Lauren returned to Macon from her sister's wedding. She had a lot to do: unpacking, organizing her study materials for the bar exam, preparing to eventually pack up her apartment for her planned move. It was a Saturday, and the summer heat in Georgia was already building toward the oppressive humidity that defines southern summers. That evening, Lauren did what many young people do on a Saturday night. She met up with friends, enjoying one last bit of social time before she'd need to buckle down for serious bar exam preparation. They went out, had drinks, laughed and talked, and enjoyed being young and free and full of potential. Lauren was in good spirits. She was exactly where she wanted to be in life. The evening wound down as evenings do. Friends said their goodbyes, made plans to catch up again soon, headed to their respective homes. Lauren returned to her apartment at Barrister's Hall. She climbed the stairs or walked along the exterior corridor to her unit, unlocked her door, stepped inside and closed it behind her. She had no way of knowing that someone had been watching her, someone who had been planning, someone who had been waiting. Stephen McDaniel was also a recent graduate of Mercer University School of Law. He'd walked the same halls as Lauren, sat through the same classes, experienced the same pressure cooker environment that defines legal education. On paper, they were peers, colleagues, fellow travelers on the path to legal careers. But Stephen McDaniel was not like Lauren Giddings, not in any way that mattered. McDaniel lived in the same apartment complex as Lauren, Barrister's Hall. They were neighbors, which meant they'd likely passed each other countless times over the years. A nod in the hallway, a brief greeting while checking mail, the kind of casual, meaningless interactions that define apartment living. But for McDaniel, these interactions meant something very different. He'd become fixated on Lauren in a way that went far beyond neighborly awareness. He watched her. He thought about her constantly. He had at some point crossed the line from neighbor to stalker, though no one knew it yet. Those who knew McDaniel during his time at Mercer would later struggle to reconcile what they'd known of him with what he'd eventually be revealed to be. He was awkward, certain, socially uncomfortable in a way that made interactions with him feel slightly off. Though nothing you could quite put your finger on, he didn't make friends easily. He seemed isolated, separate from the social connections that sustain most people through difficult periods. But awkward isn't criminal. Socially uncomfortable isn't dangerous. Many people are introverted or struggle with social situations without harboring any darkness. Stephen McDaniel, however, was harboring something far worse than social anxiety. He developed an obsession with Lauren. At some point, and the exact timeline remains unclear, he begun actively stalking her. Not just watching from afar, but deliberately positioning himself to observe her, to track her movements, to invade her privacy in ways she never suspected. McDaniel had something that gave him access Lauren never knew about, a master key to the apartment complex. The details of how he obtained this key remain part of the disturbing calculus of this crime. But having it meant that locked doors weren't actually locked to him. Privacy wasn't actually private. Safety was an illusion. According to what McDaniel would eventually confess, he'd been planning something terrible for some time. In June 2011, about 2 weeks before Lauren's murder, McDaniel had traveled to Pike County, Georgia, roughly 50 miles northwest of Macon. His grandfather owned land there. McDaniel surveyed that land, walking through woods, noting locations, planning something almost incomprehensible in its coldness. He was looking for places where he could scatter dismembered body parts. He was planning murder, planning how to dispose of evidence, working through the logistics of killing someone and making them disappear. And he was doing all of this while still functioning in normal society. Graduating from law school, interacting with classmates, maintaining the facade of a normal person. On the night of June 25, 2011, while Lauren was out with friends, McDaniel was filming her apartment from outside. He'd positioned himself where he could look through her windows, his camera recording, documenting her space, perhaps waiting to see when she'd return. The premeditation was chilling. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. This was planned, calculated, thought through in advance. When Lauren returned home that night and eventually went to bed, she had no idea what was coming. She locked her door, as anyone would, feeling safe in her own home. But locks don't matter when someone has a key. In the early morning hours of June 26, 2011, technically Sunday morning, Stephen McDaniel used his master key to enter Lauren's apartment. He prepared for this. He wore a mask and gloves. He moved quietly through her space, this place where she slept and studied and lived her life, and he made his way to her bedroom. What happened next is almost too horrific to fully process. McDaniel strangled Lauren Giddings with his hands as she slept. She was in her own bed, in her own home, in the place where she should have been safest. The attack was personal and brutal. Strangulation is an intimate form of murder that requires sustained pressure, time, physical contact. Lauren fought for her life in those terrible moments, but she had no chance against an attacker who'd planned this attack and had the element of surprise. When it was over, when Lauren was dead, McDaniel left her body in her apartment and departed. But his work wasn't finished, not even close. On Monday, June 27th, McDaniel returned to Lauren's apartment. What he did there is almost incomprehensible. He went into her bathroom and used a hacksaw to dismember her body. The bathroom where she'd gotten ready for classes and social events, where she'd performed the mundane rituals of daily life, became the scene of something grotesque beyond imagining. This wasn't a panicked attempt to hide evidence. This was methodical, calculated. McDaniel worked in that bathroom, sawing through bone and tissue, reducing a vibrant human being to parts that could be transported and hidden. The sheer coldness required to do this, the complete absence of empathy or humanity, speaks to something fundamentally broken in McDaniel's psychology. He left Lauren's torso in a trash bin outside the apartment complex, just steps from where they both lived. Her head and other body parts were taken elsewhere, where exactly McDaniel has never fully revealed, and they've never been found. That decision to hide parts of her body in multiple locations shows continued calculation. He was thinking about discovery, about investigation, about trying to make it difficult to identify her or piece together what had happened. For several days, Lauren's torso remained in that trash bin. People walked past it. Life at Barristers Hall continued. No one knew. When Lauren didn't respond to calls or messages, people began to worry. Her friends knew she was dedicated to her bar exam preparation, but this was different. She wasn't answering her phone. She wasn't responding to texts. For someone as social and connected as Lauren, this silence was alarming. Her family grew increasingly concerned. Lauren had just been with them for her sister's wedding. She'd been in great spirits, excited about the future. There was no reason she would suddenly cut off contact. Something was wrong. On June 30th, 2011, Lauren was officially reported missing. The Macon Police Department began investigating, and Detective Steve Gatlin took the lead. When police went to Lauren's apartment to conduct a welfare check, they found her car in the parking lot. That was concerning. If she'd left voluntarily, she likely would have taken her car. Inside her apartment, things looked mostly normal. There was no obvious sign of a struggle or disturbance, but Lauren wasn't there, and no one knew where she'd gone. The investigation kicked into high gear. Police began canvassing the area, talking to neighbors, trying to piece together when Lauren had last been seen and what might have happened to her. They posted flyers. They reached out to her friends and family. They checked hospitals and other locations. Lauren seemed to have simply vanished. As part of their investigation, police naturally interviewed residents of Barristers Hall. One of those residents was Stephen McDaniel. This is where the case takes one of its most bizarre and chilling turns. On the day that Lauren was officially reported missing, McDaniel agreed to be interviewed by a local news crew that was covering the story of the missing law student. He positioned himself as a concerned neighbor and fellow law school graduate, someone worried about what had happened to Lauren. The video of this interview would later become infamous. McDaniel appeared on camera standing outside the apartment complex, speaking with the reporter. He talked about Lauren, described her as someone he knew from law school, expressed appropriate-sounding concern about her disappearance. He was wearing a Mercer Law t-shirt, presenting himself as just another worried member of the community. But there was something off about him. His affect was flat. His words expressed concern, but his face and body language seemed disconnected from those emotions. He spoke in a monotone voice with an oddly robotic quality. People who have watched this video often described feeling an intuitive sense that something wasn't right, even before knowing the truth. During the interview, the reporter casually mentioned something they'd found near the apartment complex. McDaniel's reaction was captured on camera. His face fell. His eyes seemed to lose focus. He started to sway slightly. The reporter, not realizing what they were witnessing, continued talking, but McDaniel seemed to be somewhere else entirely. What the reporter didn't know, but what McDaniel had just realized, was that police had found Lauren's torso in that trash bin. The body had been discovered. The investigation had just shifted from a missing person case to a murder investigation. And McDaniel knew in that moment, standing in front of a camera with a microphone in his face, that everything was about to fall apart. The video shows him struggling to maintain his composure. He seems to be calculating, processing, trying to figure out what this means for him. It's a chilling glimpse into the mind of someone who'd committed an unthinkable crime and was now watching his plans crumble in real time. When police used luminol in Lauren's apartment, the chemical that reveals traces of blood invisible to the naked eye, the bathroom lit up like someone had flipped a switch. The entire bathtub glowed under the luminol's light. Blood had filled that tub almost to the rim, approximately 2 inches from the top. The sheer volume was staggering. This was where McDaniel had dismembered Lauren's body, and despite whatever cleaning he'd attempted, the evidence remained. Detective Gatlin and his team now had a crime scene and a victim. What they needed was concrete evidence linking a suspect to the murder. Stephen McDaniel was already on their radar. He was a neighbor. He'd been acting strangely, and there was just something about him that troubled investigators. But suspicious behavior isn't proof. On July 1st, 2011, police brought McDaniel in for questioning. What followed was one of the most unusual interrogations in recent true crime history. For 2 hours, McDaniel sat across from investigators, and for most of that time he said virtually nothing. Not in the way that someone refusing to answer questions says nothing. He literally didn't speak. He sat motionless, staring, his face blank. When detectives asked questions, he didn't respond. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't proclaim his innocence. He didn't get angry or defensive. He simply sat there like a machine that had been powered off. Interrogators are trained to read body language, to notice signs of stress or deception, to pick up on the tells that most people unconsciously display when lying or under pressure. But McDaniel gave them almost nothing to work with. The video of this interrogation has circulated online, and people who watch it describe it as deeply unsettling. There's something inhuman about McDaniel's lack of response, his ability to simply shut down and become nearly catatonic. Psychologists who have analyzed his behavior have suggested it might be a dissociative response, or perhaps a calculated strategy to avoid saying anything incriminating. Whatever the cause, it made for a surreal and disturbing interrogation. Eventually, as the interrogation went on, McDaniel made a brief statement that was both bizarre and telling. He said something about how if something happened to someone, the most logical suspect would be a neighbor. It was an odd thing to say, simultaneously appearing to distance himself while also revealing that he'd been thinking about exactly this scenario. While McDaniel was being questioned, police were conducting searches. They obtained warrants and searched his apartment at Barrister's Hall. What they found there painted a picture of someone whose inner life was very different from what he projected to the world. On McDaniel's computer, investigators found videos he'd filmed of Lauren. These weren't casual videos from social gatherings or shared moments between friends. These were surveillance videos filmed surreptitiously from outside her apartment. McDaniel had been watching her through her windows, recording her in her private space without her knowledge or consent. The videos were timestamped to the same night he'd murdered her. He'd been stalking her right up until the moment he used his master key to enter her home and kill her. The videos proved premeditation beyond any doubt. This wasn't a spontaneous act. This wasn't a confrontation that escalated. McDaniel had been planning, watching, waiting. He'd invaded Lauren's privacy repeatedly before he invaded her home and took her life. Investigators also found a hacksaw in the apartment complex. When they tested it, they found blood evidence and McDaniel's DNA on the tool. This was almost certainly the saw he'd used to dismember Lauren's body. He'd apparently disposed of it somewhere in the complex rather than taking it with him, perhaps thinking it would be safer to hide it in plain sight among other residents' belongings. But perhaps the most bizarre piece of evidence involved condoms, specifically condoms that had been stolen. Investigators discovered that someone had broken into an apartment in the complex and stolen condoms. When they examined the evidence, they found that McDaniel was connected to this burglary. The condoms found in his apartment were the same brand and size as those that had been stolen. Why steal condoms? The speculation was chilling. McDaniel may have been planning to use them during a sexual assault, either as part of the murder or as a separate crime. The fact that he'd stolen them rather than simply purchasing them suggested he was trying to avoid creating a paper trail, another sign of premeditation and planning. In the end, there's no evidence that he'd sexually assaulted Lauren, but the stolen condoms spoke to his mindset and intentions. On August 2nd, 2011, Stephen McDaniel was formally charged with first-degree murder in the death of Lauren Giddings. The community was shocked, though in retrospect, many people said there had been something off about McDaniel. Teachers and classmates recalled his odd behavior, his social isolation, the vague sense of discomfort he created. But no one had imagined he was capable of something like this. The case against Stephen McDaniel was overwhelming. The physical evidence, the videos, the stolen condoms, his bizarre behavior before and after Lauren's disappearance, all of it pointed to his guilt. But prosecuting the case would take time, and the legal system moves slowly, even when guilt seems obvious. For nearly 3 years, Lauren's family waited for justice while McDaniel sat in jail. During this time, Lauren's family filed a federal lawsuit that revealed additional disturbing details about McDaniel's planning. The lawsuit detailed his trip to Pike County 2 weeks before the murder, his surveying of his grandfather's land, his search for places to dispose of body parts. The level of premeditation was extraordinary and deeply disturbing. The lawsuit also highlighted something that made Lauren's murder even more tragic if possible. McDaniel had apparently asked Lauren out at some point, and she declined, but tried to remain friendly, telling him she wanted to stay in touch. Lauren had confided to her actual friends that McDaniel made her feel uneasy, but she'd been kind in her rejection, trying not to hurt his feelings or create awkwardness since they were neighbors and classmates. That small act of kindness, trying to let someone down gently, may have been what sealed her fate. McDaniel had apparently become fixated on her, perhaps interpreting her polite friendliness as something more, or perhaps simply unable to accept rejection. For someone like McDaniel, who seemed to lack normal empathy and social understanding, Lauren's kindness might have been twisted into something entirely different in his mind. In the spring of 2014, the case finally moved toward resolution. McDaniel's trial was scheduled to begin, and prosecutors were ready to present their overwhelming evidence. But then something happened that's common in cases where the evidence is irrefutable. McDaniel agreed to plead guilty as part of a deal with prosecutors. On April 1st, 2014, Stephen McDaniel stood in court and admitted to murdering Lauren Giddings. He confessed to using the master key to enter her apartment in the early morning hours of June 26, 2011. He admitted to strangling her in her bedroom while wearing a mask and gloves. He acknowledged dismembering her body in her bathroom the following day. What he didn't do was tell anyone where he'd hidden her head and other body parts. To this day, despite extensive searches, those remains have never been recovered. Lauren's family has had to live with the knowledge that their daughter, their sister, isn't fully laid to rest. Parts of her are somewhere out there, hidden by a killer who won't reveal their location even after confessing to the murder. McDaniel was sentenced to life in prison. He'll be eligible for parole in 2041 when he'll be in his 50s. Whether he'll ever be granted parole is another question entirely. The nature of his crime, the premeditation involved, the dismemberment, and his refusal to reveal where he hid Lauren's remains. All of this will weigh heavily against him when, and if he faces a parole board. Lauren's family has continued to search for her remains. They've organized searches in Pike County, believing that the land McDaniel surveyed before the murder might hold answers. They've reached out to investigators, followed up on tips, done everything possible to bring all of Lauren home. It's a heartbreaking extension of their grief, this inability to fully say goodbye. The case has become well known in true crime circles, particularly because of those surreal video moments. McDaniel's news interview where he learns about the body's discovery, his nearly catatonic interrogation. These videos have been analyzed endlessly by people trying to understand what makes someone capable of such a crime. But videos and analysis don't really answer the deeper questions about how someone can completely lack empathy, can plan a murder in such detail, can dismember a human being, and then act as if nothing happened. It's easy when discussing true crime to become focused on the perpetrator, their psychology, their motives, their bizarre behavior. But the person who deserves to be remembered is Lauren Giddings. Lauren was 27 years old when she died. She had accomplished so much already, earning her undergraduate degree, completing law school, building friendships and connections that enriched her life and the lives of those around her. She was funny, intelligent, kind, and driven. She had plans for her future, dreams she wanted to pursue, contributions she wanted to make to the world. Her family and friends described someone who was genuinely good, not perfect. No one is, but someone whose default setting was kindness. She checked in on people. She celebrated her friends' successes. She was present in the lives of those she cared about in a world that can often feel harsh and disconnected. Lauren was someone who created warmth and connection wherever she went. She'd worked so hard to get to where she was. Law school demands incredible dedication. It requires long hours, sustained focus, the ability to master complex material and think analytically about problems that often have no clear right answer. Lauren had done all of that. She'd graduated. She was preparing for the bar exam. She was right there, right on the cusp of beginning the career she dreamed about. And then Stephen McDaniel took all of that away. He took her future, her potential, all the lives she might have touched as a lawyer, an advocate. He took her from her family. She'll never see her walk into a room again, never hear her laugh, never celebrate holidays or milestones with her. He took her from her friends who lost someone who made their lives better simply by being in them. What makes Lauren's murder even more senseless is that there was no rational motive. She hadn't done anything to McDaniel. She had been polite to him when he had asked her out. Even though he made her uncomfortable, she had simply existed in the same apartment complex, gone about her life, pursued her dreams. For McDaniel, that was apparently enough. His obsession with her, his inability to process rejection or connect with others in healthy ways, his fundamental lack of empathy. All of it culminated in a decision to kill someone who'd never harmed him. Lauren's family has worked to keep her memory alive. They've spoken publicly about her, sharing stories that paint a picture of who she really was beyond the victim of a terrible crime. They've advocated for other victims, turned their grief into purpose. It doesn't make the loss any easier, but it ensures that Lauren is remembered as a person, not just a case file. 10 years after her death in 2021, her family gathered to remember her. They shared memories, looked at photos, celebrated the time they'd had with her while acknowledging the time they'd lost. They talked about what she would have been doing if she'd lived, where her career might have taken her, whether she'd have married and had children, what causes she might have championed. These are the thoughts that haunt families of murder victims. The what-ifs, the might-have-beens, the alternate timeline where their loved ones simply came home safely that night and continued living their life. For Lauren's family, these thoughts are compounded by the knowledge that they still don't have all of her, that somewhere out there are remains that should be laid to rest, but instead are hidden in a location only her killer knows. The murder of Lauren Giddings is a reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself. Stephen McDaniel didn't look like a monster. He was a law student, a neighbor, someone who blended into the background of everyday life. He passed people in hallways, sat through classes, participated in the mundane rituals that define normal existence. And all the while, he was watching, planning, nurturing an obsession that would ultimately cost Lauren her life. For those of us who live in apartment complexes, who have neighbors we know only casually, who trust that locked doors and social conventions will keep us safe, this case is particularly chilling. Lauren did nothing wrong. She locked her doors. She was polite but maintained boundaries. She was careful without being paranoid. And none of it mattered because her neighbor had a master key and had decided she would die. The case also raises questions about how we identify and intervene with people like McDaniel before they act on violent impulses. He was awkward, yes, and socially isolated. But many people fit that description without ever harming anyone. What makes someone cross the line from awkward to dangerous? How do we protect potential victims without unfairly stigmatizing people who are simply introverted or socially anxious? These questions don't have easy answers. Mental health professionals, law enforcement, and researchers continue to study what drives someone to commit such calculated violence. But for every profile developed, for every warning sign identified, there are people who fit those patterns but never hurt anyone, and people who hurt others despite showing no obvious warning signs. What we can do is remember Lauren Giddings not as a victim whose life was defined by her death, but as a vibrant young woman who lived fully in the time she had. We can honor her memory by being kind to others, by checking in on friends, by pursuing our dreams with the same determination she showed. We can insist on justice for victims even when convictions don't bring full closure. And we can continue to grapple with the uncomfortable questions her murder raises about safety, about how we identify danger, about how we protect each other. Stephen McDaniel sits in prison, and there he'll likely remain for the rest of his life. He's become infamous for those bizarre videos, for his strange behavior, for the calculated nature of his crime. But he's not who this story should be about. This story should be about Lauren, about her laughter and her ambition, about her kindness and her intelligence, about everything she was and everything she might have become. This story should be about a family that lost someone irreplaceable, about friends who still miss her presence in their lives, about a community that was shattered by a crime that never should have happened. Lauren Giddings should be practicing law right now. She should be arguing cases, advocating for clients, making the kind of difference she'd always dreamed of making. She should be celebrating birthdays and holidays with her family, creating new memories, continuing the story of her life. Instead, her story ends on June 26, 2011 in an apartment in Macon, Georgia, at the hands of someone who saw her not as a human being with hopes and dreams and people who loved her, but as an object of obsession. That's the tragedy of this case. Not just that Lauren died, but that she died for no reason that makes any sense to people with functioning empathy and conscience. She died because someone who lived near her decided she would die. That's it. That's the whole senseless explanation. So, as we close this story, let's think about Lauren Giddings, not as a victim, but as a person. Let's remember that true crime isn't entertainment. It's a record of real tragedies that devastated real families and communities. And let's hold in our minds the image of Lauren as she should be remembered. Vibrant, intelligent, kind, full of potential, and taken from this world far too soon by someone who had no right to make that decision. Her family still searches for her remains. They still hope that someday they'll be able to bring all of Lauren home and lay her to rest completely. Until then, they remember her as she was, not as a case file or a headline, but as Lauren, beloved daughter and sister, friend, and a young woman who deserved so much more than the few short years she was given. Story 2, Ben Renick. Some stories hide in plain sight, wrapped in normalcy until the moment everything unravels. This is one of those stories. It happened in rural Missouri, in a place where neighbors knew each other, where life moved at the pace of seasons changing. But beneath the surface of an ordinary marriage, something dark was taking shape. Tonight, we're going to talk about Ben Renick. Not just how he died, but who he was, and how the people closest to him became the architects of his end. Ben Renick wasn't your typical Missouri farmer. Growing up in Montgomery County, he discovered something most people found unsettling, even frightening. He loved snakes, not just as pets, but as creatures worthy of respect, study, and yes, even breeding. While other kids his age were playing video games or tinkering with cars, Ben was learning about genetics, studying color morphs, understanding breeding patterns. He had a gift. By his early 20s, he turned that gift into something remarkable. Renick Reptiles wasn't just a hobby operation. Ben converted a barn on his family farm into his business, creating what would become one of the most respected snake breeding operations in the world. He was a pioneer in the industry, well known in the snake breeding community worldwide. Think about that for a moment. In rural Missouri, this young man had built an international reputation. People from across the globe knew his name. They sought out his pythons, his anacondas, the rare color morphs he'd spent years perfecting. Some snakes sold for thousands, even tens of thousands of dollars. He wasn't just breeding snakes, he was creating living art. The barn itself was a temperature-controlled sanctuary. Rows upon rows of specialized enclosures, each one home to serpents of extraordinary value. Pythons in colors that seemed impossible. Albino piebalds, combinations that looked like they'd been painted by hand. Anacondas massive and powerful, their scales glistening under carefully calibrated lights. By early 2017, Ben had negotiated a deal to sell snakes to NHL goalie Robin Lehner for $1.2 million with payments of $200,000 per quarter throughout the year. The business was thriving. Ben was 29 years old, and at the peak of his success. From the outside, his life looked perfect. Lindley didn't come from the world of reptiles. She was more conventional in her interests, more focused on the kind of business that dealt with people rather than cold-blooded creatures. She'd gone to massage school, learned the trade, and had ambitions of her own. When she met Ben, she found someone successful, someone building something real. They married in 2014, and Lindley joined him in running the snake operation. She wasn't as passionate about the reptiles as Ben was. Few people were, but she helped with the business side of things. By 2017, with one successful business under their belts, Lindley wanted to try her hand at running her own. Ben supported her. In 2016, she opened a spa. It was her space, her vision, separate from the snakes and the farm and everything that was so uniquely Ben's world. They had a child together. On paper, they were building a life. But marriages are complex things. What people see from outside rarely matches what happens behind closed doors. The spa became more than just Lindley's business. It became her refuge, her separate world. She hired a woman named Ashley Shaw to work there. The two became close, closer than employer and employee, more like confidants who shared secrets. And Lindley had secrets. There was Michael Humphrey, an ex-boyfriend from her past. After her marriage, after her child, after everything she built with Ben, she maintained a connection with Michael. Maybe at first it was innocent, just old friends keeping in touch. But somewhere along the way, the boundaries blurred. Michael Humphrey had an affair with Lindley. He became part of her shadow life, the one that existed parallel to her marriage. And in that shadow life, something dangerous began to grow. June 8, 2017 started like any other day in Montgomery County. The sun rose over farmland, over quiet roads where everyone knew everyone. Ben went to work at the snake facility, doing what he did every day, feeding, monitoring, caring for the creatures that represented his life's work and his livelihood. Lindley, according to what she would later tell investigators, was at her spa. But that day, someone made a decision. And perhaps the decision had been made weeks before, months before, and June 8 was simply the day it would be carried out. Around noon, Lindley received a call reporting that her husband had been found. When police arrived at the snake facility, they encountered a scene that seemed to tell a story at first glance. Ben Renick was found laying in a pool of blood inside his Missouri snake breeding facility, surrounded by his beloved snakes, face down, clearly dead. Investigators initially suspected one of his prized serpents had killed him. It wasn't an unreasonable assumption. Ben worked with dangerous animals. Anacondas can crush a human body. Some of the other species, while not venomous, could still inflict serious damage. Maybe there had been an accident, a moment of carelessness, a snake reacting defensively. But trained investigators don't rely on assumptions. They look closer. They examine. And when they examined Ben's body more carefully, the truth revealed itself in a way that no snake could have caused. The coroner determined Ben Renick was shot 6 times from behind. Other sources say he was shot 8 times in the back, once at close range. Either way, the message was clear and brutal. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a snake attack. This was murder. Someone had walked into that barn, pointed a gun at Ben's back and pulled the trigger, then pulled it again and again and again. Even after he fell, even after he was clearly dying or already dead, they made sure the final shot was to the back of his head. This wasn't a crime of passion, a split-second decision made in anger. This was execution, deliberate, planned, cold. When someone is murdered, investigators start with a simple question: who benefits? In Ben's case, that question had clear answers. Lindley Renick was the sole beneficiary of a life insurance policy for her husband worth $1 million. There was also the ongoing deal with Robin Lehner for $1.2 million for the snake business. Ben's father had died by suicide soon after his mother's death, leaving the family farm in Ben's name. Between the life insurance, the sale of the snakes, and the family farm that she would inherit, Lindley stood to gain millions from the death of her husband. But financial motive alone doesn't make someone a murderer. Investigators needed evidence. They needed to understand what had really happened, and they needed someone to talk. For months, the case seemed stalled. Lindley played the grieving widow. She attended memorials. She spoke to reporters about her loss. She maintained her innocence, her shock, her devastation. Behind the scenes, though, investigators were building a case. They were talking to people. They were following leads. They were patient. And patience in murder investigations often pays off. The truth, when it finally emerged, was more complex than a simple murder. This wasn't one person acting alone in a moment of rage. Prosecutor Kelly King said Lindley Renick tried to kill Benjamin Renick twice. Twice. Let that sink in for a moment. This wasn't even the first attempt. Ashley Shaw and Michael Humphrey helped Lindley Renick with the plans to kill her husband. The woman from the spa, the ex-boyfriend, they became co-conspirators in a plot that would stretch over time, that would involve multiple attempts, multiple conversations, a web of lies and planning. The first attempt, according to testimony that would later emerge in court, involved poison. It failed. Ben didn't die. Maybe he got sick and recovered. Maybe the dose wasn't right. Maybe luck intervened. But Lindley, according to prosecutors, didn't give up. She tried again. On June 8th, Lindley Renick and Humphrey went to the snake farm. What happened next depends on whose story you believe, and that's where this case gets truly interesting. Because when it came time for trial, when everyone's secrets were laid bare, the stories didn't match. According to prosecutors and testimony from Ashley Shaw and Michael Humphrey, Lindley was the one who pulled the trigger. She was the shooter. She was the one who stood behind her husband and ended his life. But Lindley told a different story. On January 16, 2020, cops made their moves. Lindley Renick and Michael Humphrey were arrested and charged with the murder of Ben Renick. Nearly 3 years after Ben's death, the case finally moved toward justice. Michael Humphrey went to trial first. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. But there was a twist. He agreed to testify against Lindley in exchange for a reduced sentence. When Lindley's trial began in December 2021, the courtroom became a stage for competing versions of the truth. Lindley Renick testified that Humphrey drove her back to her spa where Shaw washed her off in the shower. Shaw testified that she washed blood off of Lindley Renick. And think about that detail. Blood on Lindley's body washed away in the shower at the spa. Whether she was the shooter or merely present, she was involved. She had her husband's blood on her skin. Lindley's defense attorney acknowledged Lindley Renick was with Humphrey on the night of the killing, but said she was not present when her husband was shot. The defense claimed that on June 8, 2017, Lindley Renick and Humphrey went to the snake farm to talk to Ben about divorcing his wife. He said Lindley heard several shots as she was taking out the trash. So, in Lindley's version of events, she went to the farm. Yes, she brought Michael. Yes, but she was just taking out the trash. Innocent, incidental. When Michael suddenly and without her knowledge murdered her husband. But Humphrey and Shaw told the jury that was a lie. When Lindley left the spa after being washed, she said she didn't think her husband was dead, only that something bad had happened. The jury had to decide. Was Lindley a grieving wife caught in a terrible situation? Or was she a calculating woman who orchestrated her husband's murder and then tried to pin it on her accomplices when the investigation closed in? Lindley Renick was convicted of second-degree murder, not first degree, which would have required proof of premeditation and planning. Second degree, which acknowledges the intentional killing but perhaps suggests the jury had some doubt about the full extent of her planning or involvement. She received a sentence of 16 years. Michael Humphrey got life, though with the possibility of reduction for his testimony. Ashley Shaw, who cooperated with prosecutors, wasn't charged. So, what really happened? Even with the convictions, some questions linger. Did Lindley pull the trigger herself, or did she stand by while Michael did it? Were both of them involved in the physical act, or was one the shooter and one the accomplice? It was alleged that Lindley feared losing custody of her children if she and her husband were to divorce. Maybe that was part of her motivation. Maybe the money was the primary driver. Maybe it was a combination. The farm, the insurance, the business, the fear of losing everything in a divorce. Or maybe, as sometimes happens in marriages that turn toxic, she simply wanted him gone. The case fascinated people. Ben Renick was a rock star of the reptile world, and his murder had elements that seemed almost fictional. Exotic animals, $1 million business, a love triangle, poison, multiple murder attempts, a widow who may or may not have been a killer. When arrests were made, loved ones and friends of Lindley never saw it coming. Those who knew her expressed disbelief. To them, she was the grieving widow, the mother, the businesswoman. The idea that she could have orchestrated something so brutal seemed impossible. But that's often how these stories go. The people who commit the worst acts are rarely the ones who look like monsters. They're the neighbors, the spouses, the people who smile and wave and seem perfectly normal. Ben's brother Sam inherited what was left of the snake business. The breeding operation that Ben had built from nothing, that had become internationally recognized, had to continue without him. The snakes didn't care about murder or trials or justice. They needed to be fed, maintained, cared for. Life in its cold-blooded way went on. Robin Lehner, the NHL goalie who'd made that $1.2 million deal with Ben, found himself tangled in the aftermath. Lehner had made one payment of $200,000 in February 2017 before Ben's death. The remaining payments, the transfer of the business, all of that became complicated by the murder, by the legal proceedings, by questions of who now owned what. Cases like this make us ask uncomfortable questions about marriage, about money, about what people are capable of when they want something badly enough. Prosecutors alleged that Lindley conspired with a friend and ex-boyfriend to murder her husband in 2017. If true, it means she didn't just snap one day. She planned. She recruited help. She made multiple attempts, and when her husband lay dead in a pool of blood, she washed that blood away and tried to pretend she knew nothing. Was it the $1 million life insurance, the valuable farm, the business worth millions? Or was it simpler than that? A woman who wanted a different life and saw her husband as an obstacle rather than a partner. Ben Renick spent his short life building something remarkable. He turned a barn into an internationally recognized breeding facility. He mastered genetics and created living works of art in scales and muscle. He was 29 years old at the height of his success, with years of accomplishment still ahead of him. Someone decided he shouldn't have those years. He was shot in the back several times and then ultimately shot in the back of the head. He never saw it coming. In a place where he felt safe, surrounded by the creatures he loved, he was murdered. The snakes, of course, had nothing to do with it. The initial assumption that something in that barn had killed him was wrong. The danger didn't come from the pythons or the anacondas. It came from something far more common and far more human: greed or desire, or the toxic end of a relationship gone wrong. The murder of Ben Renick is still shocking even years later. It started with a farm full of exotic animals and ended with a man betrayed by someone he trusted most. That betrayal is perhaps the cruelest element of the whole story. Ben died because someone close to him wanted him dead. Whether Lindley pulled the trigger or orchestrated it from a step removed, she was part of the plot. The woman who'd married him, who'd had a child with him, who'd built businesses alongside him, she became part of his ending. Michael Humphrey, who confessed to helping with Ben's murder, will spend much of his life in prison. Lindley Renick will spend 16 years behind bars, though she'll be eligible for parole eventually. Ashley Shaw, who washed blood from Lindley's body, avoided charges by cooperating with investigators. Justice, such as it is, has been served, but Ben remains dead. His family remains without him. The snake breeding operation continues without its founder. And somewhere in Missouri, a barn that was once a place of passion and business and life is now forever marked by what happened there. Story 3. Me Melendez and Layla Stewart. In the quiet city of Vancouver, Washington, where the Columbia River winds its way between Oregon and Washington state, a tragedy unfolded in March 2023 that would shake a community to its core. This is the story of Me Melendez, a 27-year-old mother, and her 7-year-old daughter, Layla Stewart. Two lives cut short by the very person who should have protected them. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't strangers lurking in shadows. Sometimes they're people we know, people we've loved, people we've trusted. Me Melendez, though some knew her as Carmen, was like so many young mothers trying to build a life for themselves and their children. At 27, she had already weathered storms that would have broken others. She had a daughter, Layla, a bright 7-year-old with her whole life ahead of her. In photographs, you can see the bond between them, a mother and daughter navigating the world together. Vancouver, Washington sits just across the river from Portland, Oregon. It's a place where people know their neighbors, where community still means something. The kind of place where you think you're safe, where you think you can start over when life gets hard. Me was trying to do exactly that. Start over. But starting over isn't always simple when your past refuses to let you go. Me had been in a relationship with a man named Kirkland Warren. Like many relationships, it had probably started with promise, with hope, with all the things we tell ourselves about love and second chances. But somewhere along the way, that relationship had turned dark. Somewhere along the way, love had become control, and control had become danger. By late 2022, Me knew she needed to get out. She knew she needed to protect herself and her daughter. But knowing you need to leave and being able to leave safely are two very different things. December 2022, the holiday season when most people are thinking about family gatherings and new beginnings. For Me Melendez, December brought terror. She went to the Vancouver Police Department with a story that should have sent chills down anyone's spine. Her ex-boyfriend, Kirkland Warren, had assaulted her with a firearm. He had threatened to kill her. And in an act that seemed ripped from a nightmare, he had fired shots at her home from a moving vehicle. What police would call a drive-by shooting. Think about that for a moment. Imagine being in your home, the one place you should feel safe, and hearing gunshots. Imagine knowing that someone you once cared about now wanted you dead. Me did what she was supposed to do. She reported it. She sought protection. The system was supposed to keep her safe. What Me didn't know, what would later become a crucial detail in understanding this tragedy, was that Kirkland Warren was already on pretrial release for separate charges out of Arkansas. He was already in the system, already considered a potential threat, already supposed to be monitored. The wheels of justice began to turn, but they turned slowly, too slowly. On March 6, 2023, Warren appeared in district court regarding the citation from the December incident. Vancouver Police Sergeant Deb Libby, the officer who had authored the probable cause affidavit, made a specific request to the court. She asked that if Warren were released, he should be required to wear a GPS monitor and be subject to higher bail. She understood the danger. She had seen cases like this before. She knew what could happen. Judge Kristen Parcher set bail at $10,000 and issued conditions of release. There was already a court order in place prohibiting Warren from contacting Melendez. On paper, everything looked secure. The system had responded. Protections were in place. The court orders are just pieces of paper. GPS monitors can be removed, and bail for some people is just a price to pay for freedom. Warren posted bail. He was released, and the clock began ticking toward tragedy. March 12, 2023 began like any other day in Vancouver, Washington. Spring was beginning to arrive in the Pacific Northwest, bringing with it the promise of longer days and warming temperatures. But for Mie Melendez and her daughter Layla, this day would be their last. When someone goes missing, there's usually a moment when people realize something is wrong. A missed appointment, an unanswered phone call, a car parked in an unusual place. For Mie and Layla, that moment came when they simply didn't show up where they were expected to be. On March 12th, family and friends reported them missing. Imagine the rising panic. Calls going straight to voicemail. Text messages turning blue but never showing as read. Knocking on a door that no one answers. The kind of silence that makes your stomach drop because you know somewhere deep down that something is terribly wrong. The Vancouver Police Department began their investigation immediately. In missing persons cases, the first 48 hours are critical. The longer someone is missing, the less likely they are to be found alive. Detectives worked around the clock canvassing the neighborhood, interviewing friends and family, checking surveillance cameras, doing everything they could to find Mie and Layla. But March 12 became March 13 and then March 14, and then March 15. Days passed with no sign of the mother and daughter. No activity on Mie's phone, no credit card transactions, no sightings. It was as if they had simply vanished. Except people don't simply vanish. Not really. Someone always knows something. And in this case, investigators had a strong suspicion about who that someone was. Kirkland Warren, the ex-boyfriend with a history of violence, the man who had shot at Mie's home, the man who was supposed to be staying away from her, but who had a way of ignoring court orders when it suited him. Warren was quickly named as a person of interest in their disappearance. Detectives wanted to talk to him, to find out what he knew, to understand his movements on March 12 and 13. But being a person of interest isn't the same as being a suspect. And being a suspect isn't the same as being charged. The law requires evidence, proof, something concrete. And so the search continued, expanding outward from Vancouver into the surrounding areas. The Columbia River Gorge stretches east from Vancouver, a landscape of dramatic cliffs and dense forests, of winding roads and isolated areas where someone could hide almost anything. March 22, 2023. 10 days after Mie and Layla were reported missing. 10 days of hopping against hope that somehow they were alive, that somehow this story would have a different ending. But this story was always going to end in a rural area east of Washagal, a small city about 20 miles east of Vancouver. The landscape there is beautiful in that way that the Pacific Northwest is beautiful. Towering evergreens, rolling hills, the kind of place where nature still feels wild and untamed. It's also the kind of place where bodies can be hidden. Authorities found them together, mother and daughter, in an isolated area where no one had any reason to be. The Clark County Medical Examiner's Office would later determine the cause of death for both Mie Melendez and 7-year-old Layla Stewart. Gunshot wounds to the head. Think about that for a moment. A 7-year-old child shot in the head. Whatever else this story is about, domestic violence, systemic failure, the dangers of ignoring warning signs, it's also about the murder of a child who had no way to protect herself, no way to understand why the adult world had become so dangerous. The investigation shifted from a missing persons case to a double homicide, and Kirkland Warren, the person of interest, became the prime suspect. On April 3, 2023, Kirkland Warren made his first appearance in Clark County Superior Court. The charges were staggering: 2 counts of first-degree aggravated murder in Washington state. First-degree aggravated murder is the most serious crime on the books, reserved for murders that involve specific aggravating factors. In Warren's case, those aggravating factors were clear. There was a court order prohibiting him from contacting Melendez. There was a documented history of violence. And there was the victim, Layla Stewart, a child, making one of the murders an aggravated charge under the law. Warren pleaded not guilty. It's a standard move in the legal system, a way of putting the burden of proof on the prosecution, of saying, make your case. But as the investigation continued, that case began to build. On May 9, 2023, additional charges were filed: 2 counts of violating a protection order, 1 count of tampering with a witness, 1 count of second-degree unlawful possession of a firearm. These charges were tied to the drive-by shooting case from December 2022, the incident that had first brought Warren into the criminal justice system. Then in October 2023, 7 months after the bodies were discovered, prosecutors added another charge, one that made an already horrific case even darker: first-degree child molestation involving Layla Stewart. It's difficult to write those words. It's difficult to think about what that 7-year-old girl must have experienced, not just in her final moments, but potentially for who knows how long before that. The monsters in our stories are often just that: stories, fiction, things we can close the book on and walk away from. But real monsters don't live in fairy tales. They live in our neighborhoods. They walk into courtrooms in handcuffs and answer to judges and lawyers. On March 26, 2023, hundreds of people gathered in Vancouver to mourn and honor Me Melendez and Layla Stewart. Vigils like these are common after tragedies. A way for communities to process grief, to come together, to say that these lives mattered. But this vigil was different. There was grief, yes, overwhelming, devastating grief for a mother and daughter whose lives had been stolen. But there was also anger. Anger at a system that had failed to protect them. Anger at the fact that Kirkland Warren had been free to commit murder. Despite all the warning signs, despite all the reports, despite all the protections that were supposed to be in place, people held candles, they shared memories, they cried, and they asked the question that always comes up in cases like these: how did this happen? How did we let this happen? The answer, of course, is complicated. Domestic violence cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute. Victims often recant their statements, whether out of fear or hope that their abuser will change. The burden of proof is high. Bail systems are designed to balance public safety with the presumption of innocence. And sometimes, even when everyone does everything right, terrible things still happen. But in this case, there were signs that everyone hadn't done everything right. There were questions about why Warren was released on bail despite his history. Questions about whether the GPS monitoring that Sergeant Libby had requested was actually implemented. Questions about whether a system designed to protect victims of domestic violence had instead become a system that enabled their deaths. Those questions would eventually lead to a lawsuit. The family of Me Melendez and Layla Stewart filed suit against Clark County, alleging that the county had negligently released Warren on bail before the murders. The lawsuit claimed that Warren murdered Melendez and Stewart while out on bail, despite the fact that he was already on pretrial release for charges out of Arkansas, despite the fact that there was a documented history of violence, despite the fact that a police sergeant had specifically asked for higher bail and GPS monitoring. It's the kind of lawsuit that asks us to examine the systems we've put in place to protect people, and to question whether those systems are actually working. After the initial arraignment, the case moved through the legal system at the pace these things always move, slowly, methodically, with continuances and motions and hearings that the public rarely hears about. A trial was initially scheduled for June 2023, then pushed back. In the world of criminal justice, delays are common. Defense attorneys need time to review evidence, to prepare their case, to investigate alternative theories. Prosecutors need time to organize their evidence, to prepare witnesses, to build a narrative that will convince 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt. By August 2024, 18 months after the murders, the case was finally ready to go to trial. The trial date was set for September 9th, 2024. For the family and friends of me and Layla, it must have felt like an eternity. 18 months of waiting, of wondering whether justice would be served, of reliving the worst day of their lives over and over again through court documents and legal proceedings. But then, just days before the trial was set to begin, something unexpected happened. On September 5th, 2024, Kirkland Warren changed his plea. Instead of going to trial and forcing prosecutors to present their case, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in the death of Me Melendez and aggravated first-degree murder in the death of Layla Stewart. Why would someone change their plea at the last minute? Sometimes it's a strategic decision, a way to avoid the death penalty or to gain some control over sentencing. Sometimes it's because the evidence is so overwhelming that going to trial would be pointless. Sometimes it's because a defendant finally accepts what they've done and decides to spare the victims' families the trauma of a trial. We may never know Warren's true motivation, but along with the murder pleas, he also entered what's called an unsolved plea to first-degree child molestation. An unsolved plea is a peculiar legal mechanism that allows a defendant to maintain their innocence while acknowledging that the prosecution has enough evidence to convict them. It's a way of saying, I'm not admitting I did this, but I recognize that a jury would probably find me guilty. The unsolved plea was for sexually assaulting Layla Stewart. October 8, 2024, nearly 19 months after me and Layla were murdered, Kirkland Warren appeared in Clark County Superior Court for sentencing. Sentencing hearings in murder cases are often emotional affairs. They're the one time when victims' families get to speak directly to the defendant, to tell them about the pain they've caused, to humanize the people who were killed. These statements are called victim impact statements, and they're some of the most powerful moments in the entire criminal justice process. We can only imagine what was said that day. The grandmother who would never see her granddaughter grow up, the siblings who lost a sister, the friends who lost someone they loved, the community members who came to bear witness. And through it all, Kirkland Warren sat there. The man who had taken 2 lives, the man who had destroyed a family, the man who had proven that court orders and bail conditions and protection orders are meaningless if someone is determined enough to ignore them. Judge Darvin Zimmerman delivered the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole for the aggravated first-degree murder of Layla Stewart, plus additional time for the murder of Me Melendez and the child molestation charge. Life in prison, no parole, no second chances, no possibility of ever walking free again. For some, this brings a sense of justice, a feeling that the punishment fits the crime. For others, no sentence could ever be enough because no sentence can bring back a 27-year-old mother and her 7-year-old daughter. The story of Me Melendez and Layla Stewart doesn't end with the sentencing. It continues in the lives of the people they left behind, in the changes that their deaths might inspire in how we handle domestic violence cases, in the questions that still linger about how this tragedy could have been prevented. The lawsuit against Clark County continues to work its way through the civil court system. Win or lose, it represents something important, an attempt to hold institutions accountable, to force a reckoning with the systemic failures that allowed Kirkland Warren to be free when he should have been behind bars. Domestic violence is a pattern. It escalates. It doesn't get better on its own. And when someone threatens to kill you, when someone shoots at your house, when someone assaults you with a firearm, those aren't just red flags. They're flashing neon signs that say this person is capable of murder. Mi Melendez saw those signs. She reported them. She tried to get protection. She did everything right. And she was still murdered along with her young daughter. That's the part that's hardest to accept. That someone can do everything they're supposed to do, can trust in the system, can believe that law enforcement and the courts will keep them safe, and still end up dead in a rural area east of Washogal with a bullet in their head. In the aftermath of tragedies like this, there's often a tendency to focus on the perpetrator, to analyze their motives, to dig into their background, to try to understand how someone becomes capable of such violence. And while that analysis has its place, it can sometimes overshadow the people who were actually harmed. So let's remember Mi Melendez, not as a victim, but as a person. A 27-year-old woman with hopes and dreams and plans for the future. A mother who loved her daughter. Someone who laughed and cried and got angry and felt joy. Someone who was trying to build a better life, who was trying to escape a dangerous situation, who deserved to live to see 30 and 40 and 50. And let's remember Layla Stewart, 7 years old, a child who should have been worried about homework and playground games and what to be for Halloween, a child who should have had decades ahead of her, who should have grown up to be whoever she wanted to be, a child who was failed by the very adults who should have protected her. Their names were Mi Melendez and Layla Stewart. They lived in Vancouver, Washington. They were murdered in March 2023 by someone who had been given every opportunity to hurt them because the system that was supposed to protect them didn't work. As we close this story, we're left with the questions that always linger after tragedies like this. How many other Mi Melendez are out there right now? How many women have restraining orders that exist only on paper? How many people are living in fear of an ex-partner who has been released on bail despite a history of violence? The statistics are grim. Domestic violence is one of the leading causes of death for women in the United States. And the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence is when they try to leave. That's when abusers feel their control slipping away. That's when threats become actions. If she tried to leave, she reported the violence. She got a protection order and she was still killed. What does that say about our system? What does that say about our priorities as a society? These aren't easy questions and they don't have easy answers, but they're questions we need to keep asking because every time we stop asking them, every time we accept that this is just how things are, someone else becomes a statistic. Kirkland Warren will spend the rest of his life in prison. That's a form of justice. But Mi Melendez and Layla Stewart are still dead. That's the truth that no sentence can change. This has been the story of Mi Melendez and her daughter, Layla Stewart. 2 lives cut short in March 2023 in Vancouver, Washington. May they rest in peace, and may their story remind us of the work that still needs to be done to protect victims of domestic violence. Thank you for listening to tonight's stories. If you enjoyed them, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you're still awake, I'd love to know which story stayed with you the most. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from tonight. Until next time, sleep well, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the most unsettling things hide in the quietest moments. Good night.